On a November night in 1989, a mob surged toward a building in Dresden, East Germany, screaming for blood. Inside, a thin, unremarkable KGB officer picked up the phone and called Soviet military headquarters, begging for backup. The answer came back cold. Without orders from Moscow, no one was coming. He was on his own, with nothing but a locked door and his own voice between him and the crowd. He stepped outside anyway, looked into the eyes of hundreds of people, and lied. He told them armed guards were waiting inside and that anyone who advanced would be shot. The crowd hesitated. Then it turned and walked away. That officer was Vladimir Putin, and what he learned that night, that a bluff delivered without flinching can move a mob more than the truth ever could, would define the next 3 decades of Russian history and eventually the fate of an entire continent. To understand how a friendless boy from a rat-infested Leningrad apartment became one of the most powerful men alive, you have to go back to the rubble he was born into. Vladimir Putin came into the world on October 7, 1952, in Leningrad, a city that still bore the scars of an 872-day Nazi siege that had killed hundreds of thousands of its residents through starvation and shelling. His parents had already lost 2 sons before he was born, one in infancy, the other to hunger during the siege itself. Vladimir arrived as their last chance, their only surviving child, in a 5-story communal apartment block with no private bathroom and, according to his own recollections, rats in the stairwell. He would later describe cornering one of those rats as a boy and watching it turn and lunge at him. He said it taught him something he never forgot. Corner anything, no matter how small, and it will fight back. It was a lesson written into the bones of the entire neighborhood. Leningrad in the 1950s was a city of communal kitchens, shared toilets, and short tempers, and young Vladimir grew up scrappy, quick to throw the first punch. More interested in judo and street fights than schoolwork. His teachers remembered a boy without direction, until almost by accident, a Soviet spy film changed everything. Watching KGB agents outwit their enemies on screen, the teenage Putin decided, with startling certainty, exactly what he wanted to become. He walked into a KGB office and asked how to join. An officer told him, not unkindly, that intelligence work required a law degree first. Most boys would have forgotten the conversation by the following week. Putin didn't. He enrolled at Leningrad State University to study law with that single goal in mind, and in 1975, at 23 years old, the KGB finally took him in. For a decade, his career was unglamorous. Surveillance work, paperwork, the slow grind of a mid-level Soviet intelligence officer. His real break came in 1985, when he was posted to Dresden, East Germany, ostensibly as a translator, actually as a liaison between the KGB and East Germany's own secret police, the Stasi. It was there, 4 years later, that he stood before that Dresden mob and talked his way out of catastrophe. But the standoff left a wound that never healed. In the hours after, Putin realized that when he had needed his own government most, it had abandoned him. Within 2 years, the Soviet Union itself would collapse entirely. And Putin, along with millions of Russians, watched a superpower dissolve into 15 fractured states almost overnight. He would later call it the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century. Whatever ideology he arrived in Dresden believing, he left believing something else. That weakness at the top gets people killed, and that a country too polite to defend itself deserves what happens to it. He returned to a Leningrad that no longer existed. It had been renamed St. Petersburg, and retired quietly from the KGB with the rank of lieutenant colonel. Without a plan, he took an administrative post at his old university and almost by chance reconnected with a former professor, Anatoly Sobchak, who had just been elected the city's first democratically chosen mayor. Sobchak was charismatic, reform-minded, and utterly disorganized. Putin was neither of those first 2 things, but he was relentlessly competent, and Sobchak made him his right hand. For 5 years, Putin worked in the shadows of St. Petersburg City Hall, quietly building a reputation as the man who got things done, while corruption allegations swirled around the administration he served. When Sobchak lost his re-election bid in 1996, Putin's own position collapsed with him. It should have been the end of his story. Instead, he did something that would become his signature move for the next 30 years. Instead of disappearing, he simply relocated to where the power was. He moved to Moscow. What happened next still puzzles historians. In barely 2 years, a mid-ranking former spy with no national profile climbed from an obscure Kremlin property job to director of the FSB, the KGB's successor agency, and then to secretary of Russia's Security Council. President Boris Yeltsin, drowning in alcoholism, corruption scandals, and collapsing approval ratings, was hunting for an heir who could protect his legacy and his family after he left office. In August 1999, with barely 2% public recognition, Yeltsin gambled on Putin and named him prime minister. Weeks later, Russia was shaken by a wave of apartment bombings, Moscow, Volgodonsk, Buyansk, that killed roughly 300 people in their sleep. The government blamed Chechen separatists immediately, and Putin, with cold, blunt language, promised on television to hunt the terrorists down, even in the outhouse. What most Russians never learned, and what remains one of the most disputed episodes of his rise, is that in the city of Ryazan, residents caught FSB agents themselves planting what should have been a fourth bomb, an incident the security services first called a terrorist plot, then abruptly rebranded as a training exercise involving nothing more than sacks of sugar. Independent investigators, including a former FSB officer who was later poisoned to death in London, alleged the bombings were an inside operation designed to manufacture a war and a wartime leader. The Kremlin has always denied it, but Putin's approval ratings, which stood at 2% before the blasts, rocketed past 40% within weeks, propelled by a brutal, unrelenting invasion of Chechnya that flattened the capital, Grozny, and killed tens of thousands of people. On the very last night of the 20th century, an exhausted Boris Yeltsin appeared on national television, apologized to the Russian people, and resigned. Vladimir Putin became acting president. 3 months later, in March 2000, Russians elected him in his own right. This was only the beginning. Putin inherited a country in ruins, a currency that had collapsed, oligarchs who owned the state more than the state owned itself, and a population that had watched its life expectancy fall by years within a single decade. And for a while, the story looked almost redemptive. Global oil prices tripled, then quintupled, and Russia's economy, entirely dependent on energy exports, grew by an average of 7% a year. Pensions rose, wages rose. A country that had been trading bricks for currency during hyperinflation suddenly had a functioning middle class again. Whatever else Putin was becoming, to millions of ordinary Russians he looked, for the first time in a decade, like a leader who could keep the lights on. But the same instincts that had made him effective in a KGB standoff were now being turned inward, on Russia's own democracy. He brought the country's television networks under Kremlin-friendly ownership one by one. He stripped regional governors of the right to sit in parliament and made himself the one who appointed them. And when Russia's richest man, oil tycoon, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, began funding opposition parties, Putin had him arrested at gunpoint on a runway and sentenced to a Siberian prison camp on fraud charges that many international observers considered politically engineered. Was this really a coincidence or something more calculated? Because it kept happening. Journalist Anna Politkovskaya, who had spent years exposing human rights abuses in Chechnya, was shot dead in her own apartment building on Putin's birthday. Alexander Litvinenko, the former FSB officer who accused the agency of orchestrating the apartment bombings, was poisoned with radioactive polonium in a London hotel and died an agonizing death weeks later, naming Putin from his hospital bed. A British public inquiry later concluded the assassination had probably been approved personally by the Russian president. Opposition leader Boris Nemtsov was shot in the back within view of the Kremlin walls. And in 2020, Putin's most prominent domestic critic, Alexei Navalny, was poisoned with a nerve agent on a domestic flight, survived, and was immediately arrested upon returning home from treatment in Germany. He died in an Arctic prison colony in February 2024. But the real story goes far deeper than the bodies in Moscow and London. Russia's constitution allowed a president only 2 consecutive terms. In 2008, with his own limit reached, Putin performed a maneuver that stunned even his critics. He installed a loyal deputy, Dmitry Medvedev, as a placeholder president and quietly took the prime minister's chair himself, never once relinquishing real control. 4 years later, he simply switched back, and in 2020, pushed through constitutional changes that reset his term count to 0, opening a legal path for him to remain in power until 2036. And this is where the story takes a dangerous turn. Putin's obsession with restoring what he called Russia's rightful place in the world had never really been about the economy at all. It was about territory and about a neighboring country he did not believe was ever truly independent. In 2008, Russian tanks rolled into Georgia. In 2014, after Ukraine's pro-Russian president fled a popular uprising, unmarked Russian soldiers, later nicknamed the Little Green Men, seized the Crimean Peninsula within weeks. The world watched, sanctioned, and largely moved on. It did not prepare anyone for what came next. On February 24, 2022, after months of denial, Putin launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, sending troops across the northern, eastern, and southern borders simultaneously, aiming to seize Kyiv within days. He called it, with grim Soviet-era euphemism, a special military operation. What followed instead was mass civilian death in towns like Bucha and Mariupol. An international arrest warrant issued against Putin himself by the International Criminal Court for the forced deportation of Ukrainian children, in a war that, more than 3 years later, still grinds on without a clear end. The invasion also exposed cracks Putin had spent 2 decades trying to hide. In June 2023, Yevgeny Prigozhin, the mercenary chief whose private Wagner group had fought some of Russia's bloodiest battles in Ukraine, turned his armored convoy north and marched to within a couple hundred kilometers of Moscow in open mutiny, the most serious internal challenge to Putin's rule in his entire time in power. The revolt collapsed within a day under a hastily brokered deal. 2 months later, almost to the day, Prigozhin's private jet fell out of the sky, killing everyone aboard. The Kremlin denied any involvement. Very few people in Russia believed them. So who is Vladimir Putin, really? A KGB officer forged in the rubble of a besieged city and the humiliation of an empire's collapse. A man who has outlasted 5 American presidents, crushed nearly every rival who stood against him, and convinced tens of millions of his own people that his hand on Russia is the only thing standing between them and the chaos of the 1990s. To his supporters, he is the leader who dragged Russia back from the edge of dissolution and made the world listen to it again. To his critics, and to a growing list of governments around the world, he is a war criminal who has traded his country's freedoms and now the lives of Ukrainian civilians for his own permanent grip on power. The boy who once cornered a rat in a Leningrad stairwell learned that anything pushed into a corner will fight back with everything it has. It is the truest thing he ever said about himself. Whether history ultimately remembers Vladimir Putin as the man who rebuilt Russia or as the man who cornered it is a story that even now is still being written. One battlefield, one funeral, and one election at a time.